All right, so this is the last lecture of this bee topic, and we're going to talk about the different types of bees as well as colony collapse disorder. So let's start with the worker bee, the hardest worker. These are all female. In fact, they are twin sisters of each other. So they are very hard working. They only live between 5 and 7 weeks compared to a queen bee that lives between 6 and 7 years. So they are both pretty much the same bee. It's just that the queen bee is fertile, whereas the worker bee here is fed bee bread, which is a mix of pollen and honey and saliva. And so the bee bread makes them sterile. And so then that begs the question, why would one worker bee sterilize another? Why do they sterilize each other? Would it not be better for this worker bee to have its own children? Wouldn't that increase genetic fitness? We learned about this thing called the selfish gene. Now, the selfish gene selfishly wants you to pass on your genetic information. And so this seems to defy that rule, right? But actually it doesn't. And the reason why is because, well, we have to compare how this bee reproduces versus humans or other animals. So let's just talk about humans for a second. In humans, we have a mom and we have a dad. Now, how much genetic content do you get from your mom and your dad? Well, you only get about half. You are only half your mom and half your father. And so how does that happen? How do they only pass on half? The process is called, oh, I almost wrote the wrong thing. Oops. Meiosis. Through meiosis, there's this process called segregation, in which chromosomes are basically reduced and divided. And that only passes on half of your genetic content. And so for the mom, that's going to be an egg. And for the father, that will be a sperm. And so those come together, and that creates you. And so I like to say 2 haps make a whole. So one haploid cell plus another haploid cell makes a whole you, right? So worker bees are the result of this same process. When a queen and a drone make a baby, they do the same thing that your mom and your dad did. But the thing is all of those female bees are clones of each other. And so actually, let's just imagine that your mom is a worker bee. Now your mom could have a kid, but she's only passing on half of her genes, right? And so effectively, she's only passing on 0.5 of her genes. She would need to have 3 kids in order to have a genetic amplification of 1.5, right? Which is 150%. Whereas the worker bees can do better than that with only having 2 sisters. So if they help the queen will make a clone of them, and you are much more related to a clone than you are a child. So by helping the queen and focusing all of their energy, she gets a full 100% amplification for every sister that queen makes. So it makes more sense for the worker bee to sacrifice her own reproduction so that she can help more with raising the other larva. So it actually does work with the selfish gene. Pretty weird thing to think about. All right, so now we'll talk about drones. So drones are created to mate with queens of other hives, obviously, because you don't want to have inbreeding. And so you can kind of recognize a drone by this big eye here. And what's happening in this picture is the drone is mating with a female. And so what typically happens is you'll get one queen bee, and then you'll get a whole bunch of drones swarming around her in the sky. They typically will mate in midair, and you'll have a whole bunch of drones from a whole bunch of colonies trying to get to the queen. And sometimes you'll have multiple events of reproduction. And so there's a lot of sperm competition here. Sperm competition is when the sperm of multiple individuals compete for an egg. And so the males here have one job, and that is to outcompete the other males. And so when they ejaculate into the female, they do so with an extreme volume and extreme acceleration or velocity. So much so that when the male drone ejaculates, you can actually hear a popping sound in the air as their penises explode. So if you ever see a swarming colony of drones finding a queen, and you listen very carefully, you can actually hear that popping sound as they reproduce. So the weird thing about these drones is that they are actually haploid. And so if you remember, when I talked about your mom and your dad, they passed on half of their genetic content. And then two haps make a whole, right? So that makes you. Same thing happens when you make a worker bee. But when you make a drone, it's because the female queen did not find a mate. And so what's strange is that they can have an unfertilized egg become a male. This would be like if a human, you should know by now that females, once a month, they will go through a menstrual cycle in which the lining of their uterus will shed away, and this will create a vaginal discharge of blood and other tissues once a month. Most people call this most commonly their period. And so girls will get a period every month around the same time, and that is basically an unfertilized egg basically not being used. And so if you were a queen bee, every time you got a period, you would have a kid regardless. So if humans were like queen bees, once a month you would have a little boy. And that little boy would only contain half of the normal genetic content. They themselves would be haploid, just like a sperm or an egg. And so what's strange is to make sperm, these haploid males only go through mitosis, which is how you make all of the cells in your body. They do mitosis to make sperm, which is a very strange thing. This whole process of unfertilized eggs becoming males is known as arenatoky. Very interesting. It's kind of a check and balance too, because if there's a lack of drones in the area for reproduction, queens just start making drones, and those drones fly out and find another colony. All right, so here's kind of the process. So I just told you that a queen bee is diploid, so here you can see two sets of chromosomes. And so she'll make haploid eggs, and you can see that they only have one set of chromosomes each. And so there's a couple possibilities. If a haploid drone makes sperm through mitosis, those sperm would also be haploid, just like the parent cells. And so those haploid cells could meet a haploid egg, and that could create either a diploid queen or worker, depending on what you feed the larva. However, if there is an egg cell of a queen and it is not fertilized by a male sperm, it will become a male. It will become a drone. This last one over here is just showing that actually worker bees can make drones as well, although not frequently. And again, this whole process of unfertilized eggs becoming haploid males is arenatoky. Lastly, we have the queen. She can lay up to 2,000 eggs per day. It's her one and only job. After development, it kills all the other developing queens. It does not make any honey or any royal jelly or anything like that. The worker bees make all of that. It only lays eggs. It can live up to 6 years, sometimes even 7, I've heard. And that's compared to 5 to 7 weeks for the worker. It is genetically identical to the workers, but it has not been sterilized by the bee bread. All right, so lastly, we're going to talk about colony collapse disorders. There has been a 31% reduction in North American colonies from 2012 to 2013. That number, I believe, went over 50% in the most recent years, according to my most recent Google searches. And so that's pretty bad considering that we need them for fertilizing most of our crops. Without them, things like almond orchards just stop existing. We lose a lot of crops. So we really need our honeybees, and the problem has become so severe that we're starting to import them from places like Australia. In places like Australia, some of these bees colonies are still healthy, most likely due to the fact that they don't use as many pesticides as we do, I would guess. And so we start bringing them in, and it's actually a multi-million-dollar business, transporting bees from farms to farms. So here's the most likely causes. We have pretty bad pesticides in America. We have a lot of GMO crops with poor nutritional quality in the pollen, which the insects eat from their pollen baskets. Viral infections, and those are being transmitted by mites. There are some rumors about cell phone usage and 5G towers, but research has not shown any real correlation between cell phone tower usage and honeybees. To be honest with you, it's most likely pesticides that are the number one problem. And the reason why I'm confident in saying that is because in places like China, pesticides have already been shown to be the number one cause of colony collapse disorder. We have seen entire areas with native bee populations completely wiped out, to the point at which farmers now have to hand pollinate their crops with paintbrushes. It is absolutely crazy. Okay, so here are some parasites. These are varroa mites, and to give you an idea of how big these are compared to the bees, if we were the size of a bee, these parasites would be like a dinner plate attached to our bodies. And so they suck the blood of the insect, which would be bad enough in and of itself, but they also carry viruses like Lake Syne virus, which is basically bee AIDS, and the wing deformity virus, which you can see has pretty much destroyed this bee's wings here. Next, we have pesticides. So, oh, by the way, I just want to quickly point out, I don't just want to give problems, I want to give solutions here. One of the big solutions to this problem here have been those mushroom extracts from polypores. We have noticed that when you enrich their honey with chemicals from things like reishi and other polypore mushrooms, they tend to fight off these infections, sometimes as drastically as by 4,000% higher survival rates. Very, very effective in treating that. So we are on track for helping the bees get rid of these parasites. But then the big problem that's really hard to solve is neonicotinoids, and the reason why is because it's big, big money. Pesticides bring in a lot of money for companies like Monsanto. They create these pesticides, and then farmers become dependent on them, and so everybody's using them. And they also create crops that are specifically designed to survive these pesticides, and so farmers get stuck with using them. These neonicotinoids are created from chemical compounds that are very similar to nicotine, which is a natural chemical you've probably heard about before in cigarettes. Well, we make that nicotine from tobacco, and so tobacco is a very widely grown crop, but we can take that chemical and convert it into a pesticide. So nicotine in and of itself is a pesticide that the plant makes, and it prevents insects from eating the plant. But unfortunately, we're taking that internal pesticide and we're spraying it, sometimes with planes. And so that's affecting insects like our honeybees that aren't actually eating our crops, which is unfortunate. The solution to this is actually GMO foods. If we were to genetically modify our foods to create their own neonicotinoids, or nicotine-like compounds inside of the crop, we could actually kill insects that eat the crop rather than insects that land on the crop for pollination. The issue with this is trying to figure out how to create a pesticide that does not affect humans. Luckily, that is not unheard of. There are plenty of pesticides that don't affect humans currently that we know of. Just like chocolate is a pesticide, chocolate itself is a pesticide. It does not affect humans. It is actually good for humans, but it is deadly to things like insects and dogs. So we just need to find a chemical that specifically does not hurt us, but does hurt insects, but only when they ingest it. You see, we are spraying. We need to stop spraying, and we need to start genetically modifying. So we take the genes from something like tobacco, and we alter them, and we put them inside of our crops. Stuff like this has already been done in places like Africa with their eggplants. It has saved generations of crops from being completely destroyed by insects, and has helped the farmers there because it cuts cost on pesticides, and it also reduces the occurrence of negative side effects of using pesticides. A lot of farmers end up with cancer, and a lot of people around farms end up with cancer because it turns out these pesticides are also typically not good for people either. So we definitely need to tackle the pesticide problem in America. All right, next is the GMO nutrition. And so I mentioned that GMO is good. Genetically modifying organisms, we need to do that to create enough food to satisfy the American people and the people of the world. Through genetic modification, you can increase how quickly food grows. And so you can feed more people. This helps to solve world hunger. But the problem is that we are too focused on how big or how sweet or how delicious something is, and we're no longer concerned with how nutritional it is. And so as we breed things like corn, we can breed them to be bigger and bigger and bigger and sweeter, but we're starting to lose the nutritional value. Furthermore, the scientists who help to genetically modify these crops are not concerned with the nutrients of things like pollen. Most of these crops are not actually capable of sexual reproduction. We purposely make them unable of reproducing, and we also, so we don't focus on the pollen. The pollen loses its nutritional value, and then when bees try to make bee bread out of it, due to its poor nutritional value, it will not ferment correctly, and as a result will also not have the correct microbiome profile necessary for proper gut health. As the bee bread sits in here with this pollen, yeast is supposed to start breaking it down into a digestible form for the larva. Also, bacteria is supposed to come in and help that process. And we all know today that bacteria can actually be good for your gut health. And so we are destroying the bacteria profile and the fermentation process and the nutritional value of this pollen, which is basically starving our bees and weakening them further. And so there you go. There are some problems that we have and some solutions that we could employ, and I hope that we do. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, and I hope that you've become more aware of the current bee problem that we're having. And I hope you feel motivated at some point to look into it further and do something about it. Some easy things that you can do are try to have more flowers in your yard. You can create a little space for bees. If you see bees on your property, don't try to kill them. Try to call somebody and bring them to you to collect them. You can also help bees by getting these mushroom extracts. I showed you that website that you can visit, and that can help the bees create propolis. There's a lot you can do, and so I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks.